Welcome to Check This Out, podcast for kids.
And their grown-ups, where we talk about interesting people, places, and ponderings. My name is Amy Contreras.
And I'm Cece.
Welcome back to another episode in our newest series on
Women Who Changed the World.
February is Black History Month, so our first few Women Who Changed the World episodes honor the Black women who have worked so hard to make our world a better place. The women we are highlighting broke barriers, stood up for others, challenged what the world thought was possible, and created doors for future generations to walk through.
They did so much.
They sure did. And before we get any further, listeners, make sure you subscribe and follow our podcast so you can catch all of our new episodes for Black History Month, the series on women who changed the world, and our mini episodes on the first 7 presidents of the United States. Today's woman who changed the world is Bessie Coleman. She was the first African-American woman and person of Indigenous descent to earn her pilot's license way back in 1921.
That was a long time ago.
It sure was. And Bessie Coleman has an incredible story that I'm excited to share with you. If you've heard of Amelia Earhart but haven't heard of Bessie Coleman, then you're in for a treat. Bessie Coleman was an incredible aviator who broke a lot of barriers and served as an inspiration for both Black and female pilots for generations to come. I can't wait to talk about her impact on the world around her.
I'm excited.
Me too.
Listeners, keep your ears open.
Because at the end of the episode, we will highlight 3 of our favorite facts about Bessie Coleman that you can check out further on your own after the episode is over. See if you can guess which facts we'll highlight at the end.
Let's get into it.
Couldn't agree more. Here we go. Bessie Coleman was born in 1892 and she grew up in Texas. Bessie had a lot of siblings. Do you want to guess how many?
I don't know.
Fair enough. She had 12 siblings. She was the 10th of 13 kids.
Whoa, no way.
Yeah, and her mom, Susan, was of African American descent, and her dad, George, was of African American and Native American descent. 3 of his grandparents were Indigenous, most likely Choctaw or Cherokee. Bessie was born before planes even existed. Keep in mind, the first ever plane flown was by the Wright brothers in 1903 when she was 11 years old.
I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, we mentioned it in our episode on Amelia Earhart. Bessie grew up in the segregated South, and although her childhood was happy, she had quite a few hurdles she had to overcome.
Like what, Mama?
Beyond dealing with segregation and violence against Black people in the surrounding communities, her family didn't have a ton of resources. She had to walk 4 miles to get to the segregated school she attended as a child. It was a small school that was often lacking basic school supplies like paper or pencils. There was only a single teacher for sometimes up to 50 kids, but Bessie was a star pupil and she especially excelled at math.
She sounds really smart.
In 1901, when she was 9 years old, Bessie's childhood changed when her father, George, left the family. He left them to return to Indian Territory, as it was called at the time, or what we know today as Oklahoma. He left to find better opportunities and because of the violence and discrimination against Black people that was happening in the South and where they lived in Texas at the time. He couldn't convince Bessie's mom or siblings to go with him, so he left the family alone. Soon after Bessie's father left, her older brothers also left home, leaving her mom with 4 girls under the age of 9 to care for.
That must have been hard.
I agree, but Bessie's mom made sure her children were educated, and Bessie read a lot and completed school. When she was young, she had jobs working in the cotton fields and doing laundry for others. Bessie worked hard with dreams of a better life outside of Texas.
True or false?
Bessie Coleman graduated from college before becoming an aviator.
The answer is false.
You're right, Cece. She did attend college for a semester in Oklahoma, but she had to drop out because she couldn't afford tuition. But this didn't stop her. When she was 23, she moved to Chicago and lived with 2 of her older brothers. Bessie decided to become a beautician and she enrolled in beauty school. She became a manicurist and settled into life in Chicago. She was a very popular manicurist and she loved reading the African-American-led Chicago Defender newspaper. While living and working in Chicago, she became interested in becoming a pilot and learning to fly.
How, Mama?
Her brother, John, who had served in the military, told Bessie about women flying airplanes in France while he was there during the war. She was inspired by his stories and decided that was her ticket to a better future. She applied to almost every American flying school, but was rejected because of her race and gender.
That is not okay.
But she didn't give up. She got advice from the editor of that newspaper she loved reading, The Defender. He suggested that she learn French and apply for flying schools in France, which was more accepting of Black folks. He eventually helped sponsor her tuition to flight school.
That's amazing.
How do you think Bessie Coleman learned French? Was it A, she got a private French tutor, B, she took classes at a school in the Chicago Loop, or C, she learned while attending school in France?
I think it's B.
If you said B, that was the right answer. After taking classes and teaching herself French, Bessie Coleman traveled to France in 1920 and attended France's most famous flying school. She was accepted by the Caudron Brothers School of Aviation, a really well-respected flight school, and it was run by the people who built lots of the World War I airplanes. At flight school in France, she completed a 10-month course that included learning how to do stunts like tailspins, banking, and looping the loop. She was the only person of color in her pilot class.
My mind is blown.
Check this out. Between 1910 and 1911, 10 years before Bessie Coleman earned her license, the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, or the FAI, granted its first 10 pilot's licenses to women.
Whoa!
The first 10 licensed women pilots were all European, with the exception of Harriet Quimby, the world's first American licensed pilot. Harriet Quimby was white. After 7 months of learning, in June of 1922, Bessie Coleman earned the FAI, or Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, pilot's license. When she earned her license, she was the first African-American woman to do so, and the first person of indigenous descent. Keep in mind, listeners, another famous female aviator, Amelia Earhart, didn't earn her pilot's license from the same organization until 1923. Bessie Coleman was truly a trailblazer.
I love it.
10 months after she moved to Paris, Bessie sailed home to Chicago as an official pilot with her license from the FAI. You can see how early Bessie Coleman was as both a female and Black aviator by moving to France and pursuing her goals. But Bessie had a dream that meant she needed even more training. Any idea what her dream might have been? Was it
A,
to be the first African-American commercial pilot?
B,
To fight in the Air Force as a pilot?
C?
To open a flight school that accepted women and people of color? If you said C, that was a great guess. Bessie's dream was to open and instruct at her very own flight school. Because she knew she needed additional training and experience, she returned to Europe, where additional training would be possible. She went back to Europe for more training in early 1922, and she trained for 2 months in France and 10 weeks in Berlin, Germany. She practiced with veteran military pilots in both France and Germany. She returned to the U.S. for good in 1922 after her second round of training.
I want to check out more about that.
And when she came back to the United States, she was interviewed by newspapers who wrote about her accomplishments. On September 3rd of 1922, Bessie Coleman made history as having the first public flight by a Black woman in the United States. She was flying in a borrowed Curtiss JN-4D Jenny at Curtiss Field on Long Island.
My mind is blown.
She had several exciting demonstrations when she came back to the United States. After Long Island, she performed in Memphis, Tennessee, and then went back home to Chicago for a flying exhibition. She performed before an integrated crowd of 2,000 at Checkerboard Field in Chicago on October 15th of 1922.
Check this out.
Did you know that Bessie Coleman refused to perform flying exhibitions for segregated crowds? She would only perform if the crowds were integrated or a mix of Black and white people, and if the Black folks were allowed to enter through the same gates as the white spectators.
I like that.
Me too. Bessie Coleman earned a nickname through her exhibitions and flying performances. She was known as Queen Bess or Brave Bessie. After her initial successes in Long Island, Memphis, and Chicago, she hit a bit of a rough patch with a plane crash and struggling to book exhibitions and opportunities. Throughout, she worked very hard and saved money, and by February of 1923, Bessie had saved enough to purchase her very own plane, a Jenny, which was a type of a plane. By May of 1925, she was participating in a multi-city flying exhibition tour. Huge crowds watched her perform loops, figure eights, and parachute jumps. They even paid for short rides in her airplane. Bessie Coleman aspired to be what was called a barnstormer. Do you want to take a guess about what barnstorming was? Was it A, a pilot who traveled across the country performing stunts and offering joyrides in an airplane? B, a pilot who took off and landed from a barn using the surrounding field as the runway? Or C, a style of flying where planes outlined the shape of a barn in the sky?
I think I know the answer.
If you guessed A, you're right. Bessie Coleman established herself as a barnstormer through her travels and flying exhibitions. She traveled around the country barnstorming and participating in flying exhibitions and flying circuses.
She sounds really brave.
She was. Bessie was also a popular speaker and was even almost in a movie. She spent her time between air shows talking to audiences across the United States to promote aviation for people of minority backgrounds. Her talks were really popular, and she often earned more money than her flying shows. Bessie Coleman used her platform as an African-American pilot to advocate for people of color. She has a quote that says, "The air is the only place free from prejudice." And as we mentioned earlier, she regularly stood up to flight show organizers, asking for crowds to be desegregated and for people to be allowed to enter through the same gates as white people.
That's amazing.
It was. It took a lot of guts to stand up to the institutions she was working with like that. On April 30th of 1926, she was rehearsing for an air show in Jacksonville, Florida. Bessie's mechanic was flying the plane while they were rehearsing. During the practice, he lost control of the plane and it took a sudden dive. Bessie did not buckle her seatbelt for the rehearsal because it prevented her from looking over the side of the plane for her stunt. As a result of the unexpected and sudden dive, Bessie was thrown out of the plane and she fell to her death. The mechanic also went down with the plane and died. It was later revealed that a wrench had become loose and messed up the controls.
How sad.
Bessie was only 34 years old when the accident took her life. Over 5,000 people attended her funeral. Ida B. Wells, a civil rights activist who we'll talk about in a future episode, was mistress of ceremonies for Bessie Coleman's funeral. Her body lay in state in both Florida, where she died, and Chicago, her adopted hometown. If you remember from our episode on Rosa Parks, lying in state is an honor given to impactful people upon their death, and it's when their coffin is placed on view to allow the public to pay their respects before a funeral ceremony.
Here's a fun fact.
Bessie Coleman inspired generations of Black, female, and minority aviators. Have you heard of Dr. Mae Jemison? Well, Dr. Jemison was the first African-American woman in space. We will talk about her in a future episode of Check This Out. When Dr. Jemison went to space, she carried Bessie Coleman's picture with her on her first mission in the Space Shuttle Endeavour in September of 1992.
What an amazing story!
Yeah, Bessie Coleman didn't let anyone get in the way of achieving her dreams. Although she never got to open the flight school she dreamed of for minorities and women, her legacy inspired others and showed hopeful pilots what could be possible. Now, let's see if you can guess what our 3 favorite facts about Bessie Coleman are.
Tell us!
Okay, here we go. Fact number 1. Her brother inspired her to become a pilot from talking about female pilots he saw in France during World War I. I love that he was basically teasing her and she took this as a dare to become a pilot and show him what she could do. Fact number 2. Bessie Coleman was the world's first Black woman to earn a pilot's license, earning her license a full 2 years before Amelia Earhart. If you knew about Amelia Earhart before this episode, but not Bessie Coleman, consider why that is. Who else can you tell about Bessie Coleman and her achievements? Fact number 3. She actively used her platform as a pilot to stand against discrimination and would only perform for integrated crowds. She insisted Black people were let through the same entry gate as whites. She was brave for so many reasons, but this one amazes me every time. Now, if you've been listening to our podcast, you know that we don't just love exploring interesting people, places, and ponderings that shape the world around us.
We also love to rhyme.
Here's a poem we wrote for you about Bessie Coleman. In skies above, Bessie took flight, with dreams of flying shining bright. A trailblazer and pilot, she broke the mold. Queen Bess of the air, her story still told. She soared through the sky, showing tricks to crowds, inspiring the world, strong and proud. We remember her now for all she has done. Brave Bess, a pilot, stayed grounded for none. Thanks for listening to another episode of Check This Out. Here at the Check This Out podcast, we know there's a lot of information and it can be overwhelming to find accurate information. This podcast is a tool for you to help you do something called citing your sources. As you get older and do projects for school, you'll learn that certain types of websites or information aren't verified or have evidence to back them up. On Check This Out, we use verified sources to build the stories you hear about. Verified sources are materials or information that have been confirmed for accuracy and credibility through an evaluation process.
Our sources are
the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, womenshistory.org, FAI.org, PBS, and Encyclopedia Britannica.
See you next episode.